Alright, I can hear you asking me already. Mrs. Raines, what if I don't want to make a triangular A-frame house like you made? With little flower pots and door frames and a porch and window frames. Of course, it looks a little bit odd right now, but once you cover it over in paper mache, it'll look nice and smooth, no problem. So, let's say that instead you wanted to make a more modern house out of rectangular shapes. You can do one of two things. You can either use some boxes that are already made, or you can follow the directions on your handy dandy handout on your table and make the shapes that it asks for. So let's say that I want to make a modern house that looks like two rectangles stacked on top of each other. Maybe one will scoot out a little bit from the other so that there's an overhang and you could add some columns or something underneath, like the Savoy house in France. Problem is, you're only allowed to take one box. So what I would do, I would take my box, I would take my cardboard, and I would trace each of the shapes, which it actually tells you on this handout the same thing that you're going to do here. You need 4 of the long skinny rectangles along the side and 2 of the smaller squarish rectangles on the ends. So before I started to build, I would trace each of the sides onto the cardboard, making sure that I've got the right number of everything, and then I would cut them out. The nice thing is, if you're copying one of these boxes, you kind of have your pattern all ready for you. What if you wanted to make a square that was a different size? What if you wanted to make a real big cube or a couple of other shapes that were stacked together? Well, you would need to basically construct each piece separately and then put them together and tape them. But back to the rectangle. I'm going to cut out my 2 long skinny rectangles, at least for starters. And notice I'm not really cutting a whole lot of cardboard off. You don't want to waste a lot of this because we don't have a lot. So I'm cutting out my rectangles, sort of double checking to make sure they're about the right size. Looks to me like I'm going to need to trim a little bit. That's okay. And I notice that on the end of this box I've got enough space for the smaller squares. So that's where I would want to put them. And you don't want to trace smack in the middle of your box. Start on an edge because it's a little easier to get into cutting it and it's less wasteful. We're going to try not to waste too much on this project, or any project, obviously. So I'm tracing around them. I've got my 2 little squares. I've got my 2 big rectangles. I'm about 2/3 of the way to how many pieces I'm actually going to need. I'm going to save all the flaps and things from this because I might be able to use it, or somebody else might be able to use it when I get to the part where I'm constructing some of the little detailed stuff. So I'm going to start in a corner again, line it up, then you only have to trace and cut 2 edges instead of 4. So it actually makes it easier for you when you do it this way. Less wasteful, easier to actually do. It's just a win-win. So I noticed that I don't have enough tape. I'm going to pull off, I would guess probably at least 10 pieces of tape, maybe even more. And I've got some pretty long pieces. I could actually tear these in half for when I'm joining the pieces together. Probably a couple pieces along each edge ought to do it. And you've probably noticed I like to have the knot pattern side out. It doesn't make a difference one way or the other. I just think it's a little easier sometimes to make the paper mache stick to something that's not a smooth surface. You don't have to do it that way, but I just like to do it that way personally. If you want to do things a hard way, be my guest. And I notice I taped it a little bit too close on one of these edges, so I'm just going to reposition it a little bit. Okay, that's better. And you don't necessarily have to make them match exactly. You could use this box as your pattern, and then you could make pieces that were longer if you wanted to, or shorter if you wanted to. There's all kinds of variations you can do once you kind of understand how to do the basic technique that I'm teaching you. And it looks to me like the ends of this are maybe just a tiny bit smaller than the shapes I cut. So I'm going to trim a little tiny bit off. And looks like I need to trim a little bit more. I would say even more than measuring things with the ruler, you want to kind of get the hang of how to measure things off of what you've already got. Because you can measure it with the ruler and still come up with the wrong number. But if you measure it off of what you've designed already, it makes your life a lot easier. So I'm taping it in place. I try not to cover the entire thing in masking tape. You just want to use small little bits. The more exposed cardboard, the easier it will be to cover. So now I've got my almost perfectly matching box to the first one that I was able to take. And I could stack them off to the side. I could stack them forward a little bit. I could stack them side by side and do them different heights. There's all kinds of things you can do. And like I said, you can change them as well. They don't have to stay exactly matched.